Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The federal workforce provisions were all struck from the final version of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. But the 2026 appropriation cycle marks the next window for the Trump administration to institutionalize the agency reorganization efforts begun by DOGE. Here with insights as to what might happen next is the Staff Vice President of the National Association of Active and Retired Federal Employees, John Hatton. John, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You and I have talked many times about all of the different proposals for the federal workforce that were included at some point in the reconciliation bill. Now that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is law, most of those provisions didn't make it through. But where did they go? What's happening next to them?
Well, hopefully they don't go anywhere and they don't get passed into law. There were, I think, a few different categories of provisions that were either in the House bill or the Senate bill. There was cuts to earn federal benefits. There were policies that were to encourage people to drop their merit-based civil service protections or not advance them, whether that be an increase in retirement contributions or fees for Merit Systems Protection Board appeals. Most recently there was an increase in contributions for new hires, and then a choice between at will or a further increase in pay cut. So, in our view, a lot of bad proposals. All of them were removed either because of political opposition in the House at first, then in the Senate. Some got struck by the Senate parliamentarian because they violated the Byrd rule and points of order, and then others were taken out because of political opposition. So where do they go now? I think all the ones that didn't have political support to get, even 50 votes from Republicans in the Senate and the majority in the House, those are probably safer than they would have been before this process, in the sense that they intended to make certain cuts per their blueprint and the budget resolution. They didn't have the political support to make all those. So even unless those majorities expand on the Republican side in a future congressional election, I think in the short term, it's going to be hard for them to go back to those proposals and try to pass them. The only way you pass them on a partisan basis is through some reconciliation bill. So I know Speaker Johnson has talked about doing a second or a third reconciliation bill, but there's no real indication what that's going to look like, how they're going to try to use that. And if so, the same kind of barriers politically to including these provisions hopefully would be there in a second or a third bill. And there is definitely pretty much unanimous opposition from Democrats to these provisions. And so typically you need those 60 votes in the Senate to pass some of these, and particularly those that were subject to a Byrd rule point of order. So hopefully we're in a pretty good space in the short term. Always possible that these will be tried again in a future Congress, in a future scenario. So we'll be vigilant, but hopefully we've beaten back these threats for now.
We'll hope they're not zombies or vampires that come back in some other form.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they're proposed again, but I think the threat level is going to be different than it was under these procedures for reconciliation.
The next big opportunity for legislative initiatives is the 2026 appropriations bills, which are starting to get marked up in committee. And they're really going to be the first chance, other than the One Big Beautiful Bill, to institutionalize some of the things that DOGE has done in the short run to agencies and workforces. What are you seeing and hearing as the bills make their way into committee?
So first, the Senate is just going to start their first markups, but they haven't come to any agreement on those top line defense and non-defense numbers. And so the president's budget basically held defense spending flat for this fiscal year 2026 and made significant cuts in non-defense spending. Now, they used reconciliation to plus up funding for defense and for homeland security functions. So instead of passing it through the normal appropriations process, they got funding another way. So that allowed them to hold things like defense funding flat, where overall, if you added reconciliation, it's higher. So that's the type of what they're proposing, is to institutionalize those DOGE cuts. I expect the House to put forward appropriations bills pretty similar to the president's budget, potentially a little bit higher on the defense spending level. So trying to make that mark on the non-defense. What's happening in the Senate is still very much up in the air, to the extent that our senator is going to work on a bipartisan basis to then have a bill that they negotiate with the House and the presidency. We still don't really know their approach. Before they're starting these markups, they'll give us a little bit of a sign, but the first sign of what Congress is going to do is in a rescissions request. So for fiscal year 2025, the president has sent over to the House, which then approved, and it's now under consideration by the Senate, whether to pull back funding that has already been authorized for fiscal year 2025, particularly for USAID, PBS, and NPR. And if Republicans in the Senate decide to pass and approve that, that's going to really affect bipartisan negotiations in the Senate, because you had a bipartisan negotiated bill, even if it was then passed as a CR. What is the incentive for Democrats to negotiate with Republicans if they can just turn around and rescind the funds later on a 50-vote threshold? So there's a deadline of July 18th for that rescissions request. And so that'll be really informative of what the process is going to look like in the Senate. We also have a lot of court cases providing some uncertainty on these reorganizations and reductions in force. So a lot is still to play out. I think this will be a very influential appropriations process, both in the short term and in long term, in terms of the relationship between Congress, the courts, and the executive branch.
I'm speaking with John Hatton. He's the staff vice president of the National Association of Active and Retired Federal Employees. John, one other thing before we leave appropriations. There was a really interesting dynamic between the Senate and the House in the reconciliation process, and the Senate kind of won in the end, I guess you might say. Mm-hmm. How do you expect that dynamic to play out as they deal with the various departmental budget submissions in the appropriation cycle?
So I think, there was back and forth with the House and Senate. I think the Senate kind of won out with the final bill that the House didn't make changes to, but they negotiated beforehand on some of these more contentious provisions. It maybe jammed the House a little bit, but they still worked with the blueprint of the House. I think the appropriations process is a lot different because you have a 60-vote threshold to proceed to those appropriations bills, meaning you need Democratic support as well. So you're looking at a bipartisan negotiation in the Senate, then negotiating with the partisan product in the House. And so the whole dynamic of it changes when you add in the Democrats versus Democrats and Republicans negotiating rather than just Republicans negotiating amongst themselves.
Well, it'll be interesting to watch as it plays out. There's another big topic out there for federal employees lately, and it is a new rule from OPM about the sustainability and fitness determinations for federal employees. Can you tell us what you're watching there?
Yes, so this was a proposed rule in early June. Originally had a deadline of July. They extended the notice and comment period. But what this would do was greatly expand the ability to take adverse actions on employees with limited appeal rights. So there's also a lot going on with scheduled policy career, which is going to potentially take away challenges to terminations that are not based on merit. This is kind of another opportunity to end around that process. So typically there's suitability and fitness determinations for pre-employment screening. Do you committed some crime in the past? Does that make you not suitable to be an employee of the government? This is then now applying that standard to post-application employments. So, and also mixing in, a suitability determination with factors that could be performance. And so if an agency decides they want to terminate an employee, maybe it's outside the job conduct, maybe it's inside the job conduct, they can refer to OPM for suitability determination to remove somebody from the job. That suitability determination wouldn't have the same appeals rights to MSPB, or MSPB wouldn't have the same authority to overturn it as in the past. It's also adding new factors to the suitability determination, including things like negligent loss of government resources. Now, maybe that's, if somebody really is doing a bad job and losing government resources, and that may be a reason for termination, but could that be interpreted very broadly in a way where, you authorized a contract for a vendor and they underperformed, and that was a negligent loss of government resources. So it mixes up suitability with performance. It applies that to post-application conduct. It involves OPM in the process, which may create a bottleneck there at OPM. It limits potential appeals rights. So this is another threat to politicization of the civil service. So a way to get around some of these other requirements for terminations. So if you don't like something somebody said outside of the job, can you use the suitability determination to have them terminated? So we're really concerned about the potential for abuse of this if it goes into effect.
And so what's the timeline that you're watching now for next activities?
So they just extended a few days the comment period. So comments are in. We submitted a comment in opposition to the rule. And so they'll have to assess those comments and issue a final rule. So that always takes a indeterminate length of time. In this case, we take their time, review these comments, make changes as appropriate. But I'm not sure I expect that.
Well, there's always a lot going on. It doesn't sound like it will be a quiet summer. John, thank you as always for your insights.
Thank you.
John Hatton is Staff Vice President of the National Association of Active and Retired Federal Employees. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.